After Napoleon had seized power in 1799 after the coup d'etat, he ruled France for the next 15 years. Initially, he made a pretense to share power. He ruled as part of a triumvirate of leaders. There was still the National Assembly met, but ostensibly Napoleon was the man in charge. And by 1804, it was so clear that he was now ruling France that he had himself crowned as the Emperor of France. To many, this move marked the end of the French Revolution. They had killed one king merely to replace him with another one in 1804. But to others, Napoleon actually secured the advances that the revolution had made and was actually the saviour of the revolution. So Napoleon's rule uh, divides opinion. Some people say that he was just a dictator. Other people say that he was somebody who spread liberal ideas across Europe. One of the most important things that Napoleon did during his rule was he introduced the Code Napoleon, or the Napoleonic Code. And this was a codification of laws in France that really laid down in laws the rights of the individual, how people were equal before the law. And it's the foundation of most of the laws in France and across Europe today. And this was a real achievement and set down in stone a lot of those key principles that the revolution had fought for of equality of the individual and equality before the law. But Napoleon also, at the same time, introduced quite a lot of censorship. The revolution had come about by a lot of publishing of pamphlets and a lot of freedom of the press, and Napoleon realised that if he was to have a secure control of France, he needed to curtail any criticism, and so he made sure that there was widespread censorship, that the government had control over publishing newspapers, and he also had networks of spies who would arrest anybody who thought was criticising Napoleon. But there were only probably about 3,000 people who were actually imprisoned without a trial for political reasons. And if you compare this to the tens of thousands that were guillotined during the revolution, some people say actually Napoleon's actions were no way as extreme as what had happened before. Another real improvement that Napoleon made to France was the introduction of widespread secondary education. It had been a founding principle of the revolution that education should be available for all, and Napoleon ensured that there was a system of secondary schools, or lycées, as they're called, set up across France. However, as it turned out, these were actually mainly focused on a very rigid militaristic education that was designed to prepare good officers for the army, rather than pupils engaging in liberal arts that the people in the revolution would have wanted. But it's the foundation of the education system that was spread across Europe and that exists in France today, with the sitting of the baccalaureate exam, which was also developed during the Napoleonic time. Napoleon also welcomed the church back into French life, so the revolution had effectively banned the religion. But Napoleon signed an agreement, the Concordat, with the Pope to allow the Catholic Church to be the main religion in France. But it was under very strict rules, so the Church could not get back any of the land that they'd lost during the Revolution. The Church had no role at all in state affairs or in secondary education as well. And Napoleon was happy for the Church to deal with primary education, but not secondary education. And I think that this painting that was produced by Napoleon's favourite artist, a chap called David, who painted the picture of Marat that I've talked about in a previous video. This picture really sums up the relationship between Napoleon and the church. So here's Napoleon crowning himself emperor because he is giving himself the power. It is not the church, it is not the archbishop crowning him. So he's not taking any power from the church. The church is not involved in the state at all. But clearly the people of France are delighted because they're glad to have their religion back, and they're glad to be able to carry out those religious rites again. Another thing that Napoleon did is he ensured that any of the land changes that had happened during the revolution didn't go back to how they were before. So lots of peasants had seized lands during the revolution. Lots of nobles had lost their lands, and middle class people had taken it and become almost nobles themselves. And Napoleon realised that actually, if he was to have some kind of semblance of peace and normality in France, that actually those changes wouldn't be reversed. So peasants could keep hold of the land that they'd seized, and the middle classes could keep hold of the property that they'd seized from the nobility that had fled. But Napoleon, now that he was emperor, even though he didn't want a return to the three estates system that had plagued France in the Ancien Regime, he did allow the creation of a nobility. He began to give out awards, for example, the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor, to people for bravery or to services to France. And people who were awarded these titles effectively became a new nobility in France with special privileges afforded to them. But in no way was it a complete reversal of the revolution with a full noble ruling class once again established. But noble people did again begin to emerge in the French ruling system. Now, Napoleon was a great general, and throughout this period he ensured that the French armies continued to be successful. And you can see in this map here the extent of French conquests or French influence. So the blue countries and the purple countries are places where France either directly ruled or were countries which were closely allied to France, mainly due for fear of military consequences. And these countries that the French had influenced now accepted many of the changes that Napoleon was making in France. So the key ideas laid out in the Napoleonic Code, for example, the ideas of education. And it was due to these conquests that many of the liberal ideas of the revolution spread across Europe. Now, clearly, the British and the British royal families were key enemies of Napoleon, key enemies of the revolution. But Napoleon didn't plan to invade Britain, but he introduced what's called the continental system. So he said to countries that he controlled, do not trade with Britain. We want to try and starve them out. And this is where you get a lot of naval conflict happening between Britain and France as Britain tried to break through that stranglehold that Napoleon had. So Napoleon was incredibly successful militarily until 1812. In 1812, he decided to launch a huge invasion of Russia, and his Grande Armée, his great army, reached Moscow, but the Russian army refused to meet them in open conflict and kept on retreating, and Napoleon's army was caught in the bitter Russian winter, and only about 10% of his fighting force actually made it back to France alive. And this greatly affected Napoleon's military standing. And after 1812, he suffered several military defeats, which led him to lose power, but then he regained it again. But then was finally defeated by a coalition army of British and Prussian troops at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. He was then captured by the British and placed on the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. And there he lived for another 6 years until he died in 1821. Some people suggest that he died of stomach cancer that his father had died of. Other more conspiracy theorists think that the British put arsenic in his wallpaper and slowly poisoned him. But by 1821, this great figure in history was dead.